About what? Ethan asked, tilting his head to the right, curious. Was there any new information? There was a lot of good news, Thomas chuckled. Ethan took another sip from his glass and motioned for him to continue. First, we discovered the whereabouts of those 4 men you asked about. Ethan's eyes widened. They were hiding in New York, Thomas continued. We found a warehouse near Central Park where a large number of illegal weapons were stored. Ethan stared at his hands and nodded as understanding dawned on him. When we searched through them, they seemed mostly related to guns and other explosives. Thomas paused. But one particular object caught our attention, Mr. Lopez. Thomas held up a small metallic object. It was a tiny round device resembling an eye. Ethan's eyebrows knit together in confusion. A prototype that hid a memory chip. Ethan took a deep breath as he held it, feeling like he had been waiting for this chip to arrive. Ethan closed his eyes and exhaled heavily. He stood up, holding the prototype firmly, and walked toward the locker. There was no hesitation in his steps or voice. He unlocked it with one swift movement, placed the device inside, and took out a brown file. He returned to where Thomas was sitting and handed the file to him. Thomas looked at the file and then at Ethan. Ethan gave a confident smile, indicating for Thomas to look inside the file. You'll find everything you need, Ethan said proudly. Thomas slowly opened the file. Inside were pages with pictures printed on them, pictures of girls. Thomas looked at him with a satisfied smile on his face. Total of 50 merchandise for the drop-off, Ethan smirked. The packages were ready to go. They were all prepped and waiting for the delivery. Good. We couldn't afford any slip-ups this time. The buyers were getting impatient, Thomas nodded. Don't worry, everything was on schedule. The merchandise dash. Ethan was about to say more when he heard a noise outside the door. His eyebrow raised, and his lips formed a thin line. His expression turned hard. He checked the clock, which showed 11 p.m. He swiftly opened the door and saw Kaylee, standing frozen in front of him. Her expression was a mix of horror, disbelief, and anger. She looked like she was ready to cry. Kaylee? Ethan asked in surprise and confusion. She didn't respond. All she could manage was a small sobbing sound, and it was heartbreaking. What were you doing here? Ethan almost yelled. She flinched at his tone. He looked away and sighed heavily, his tone cold and harsh, which made her faint. Ethan looked around, reassured that no one was watching them. He picked her up and brought her inside. 1 hour after Thomas' arrival, at 10 p.m. At precisely 10 p.m., the taxi came to a halt in front of Luxor Lodgings Hotel. Kaylee settled the fare and got out, carrying her bag and laptop. Gazing up at the majestic hotel, its glass windows mirrored the city lights, creating a dazzling spectacle in the darkness. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, walking on her heels, a refreshing breeze caressed her face, carrying the vibrant aroma of the bustling city. She arrived at the hotel for a significant business conference with Ethan, and Opulent Heights had been selected as the venue. The hotel's reputation for opulence and sophistication preceded it. It was her first visit to this magnificent hotel, and she felt a surge of excitement as she approached the entrance. The doorman welcomed her warmly, opening the magnificent double doors to reveal a luxurious lobby adorned with marble floors and glistening chandeliers. The gentle melody of a piano filled the air, creating an ambience of elegance and serenity. She proceeded to the elevator and pressed the button for the 100th floor. A slight nervousness filled her as the conference held great significance for their company, particularly for their new CEO, Mr. Ethan, in revitalizing their business. The elevator doors opened, revealing a pristine hallway decorated with luxurious carpets and elegant artwork. As she made her way toward his penthouse, she took a deep breath to ease her nerves before knocking on the door. But the sound of laughter from inside forced her to stop and listen. She couldn't believe it was the same person who had given a speech at Lopez Food Company in the morning. She moved a little closer to listen to their plans clearly, but her feet staggered and she bumped into the door. Slowly, Kaylee opened her eyes. She found herself lying on a sofa she had never seen before. It looked comfortable, warm, and very soft. The cream-colored walls were adorned with abstract art, but the bright light from a lamp blinded her, so she shut her eyes tight against it, trying not to flinch away from its brightness. After a moment, her eyes adjusted to the light, and she realized she was in the Opulent Heights penthouse, which made her stomach turn. She sat up with a gasp and looked at Ethan in disbelief. He sat next to her with a gun in his right hand and a glass of wine in his left. The smirk on his face made him look like a maniac. "Hiya, sweetheart. Didn't you check your phone before coming here?" Kaylee swallowed hard and shook her head. Taking a moment to assess the situation, she thought about her phone. With trembling hands, she started pulling it out from her bag. Her fingers felt clumsy as they fumbled with it, and she almost dropped it several times. Finally, she managed to grab the device from the table and turn it on without knocking anything over, only to see nothing. What was she supposed to check? She glanced at Ethan, who was still pointing the gun at her. What am I supposed to check?" she finally managed to ask him. Her mouth was so dry she could barely speak. Wasn't he going to tell her what to check? There was something she had to do now. Was he really going to kill her? She realized she wouldn't know where to start. She had to escape first. "You have to let me go," she said desperately, putting on her best begging voice. Ethan smiled back at her. "You think?" His dark gaze traveled down to her body, making her heart stop for a couple of seconds. "I can just shoot you right there in your heart." That was when the true horror hit her. Kaylee yelled frantically and jumped from the sofa and tried to run. She was too late. Ethan didn't hesitate a moment longer. In one fluid motion, his hands pulled the trigger of his handgun and the bullet hit the wall. Hastily, she covered her ears with her fingers to muffle the sound of the gunfire, but it seemed he had used acoustic panels. Slowly she lifted her head up and saw a large hole appeared in the wall where the bullet had struck. Kaylee ran faster, but before she could get too far, she tripped on the rug and fell onto the floor. Ethan chuckled, but then raised the gun again. This time, however, he wasn't smiling anymore. "Where were you heading anyway?" he asked her. Then he stood up and calmly walked toward her until he was right in front of her. "You can't leave this place without my permission." The gun he gripped was aimed directly at her head. "You have no choice but to surrender, or else I will shoot you in your head right here and now," he uttered in a hushed, snake-like tone. His words were delivered with a casual yet chilling coldness, leaving no room for negotiation. She never expected Mr. Ethan to be like this. His expression lacked any emotion or fear, resembling more of an assassin than the owner of any company, someone who wouldn't hesitate to take a life. A shiver ran down her spine as she cautiously stepped away and tried to run again. Ethan pulled the trigger of his handgun again, causing a shot to ring out and strike the side of the wall, leaving another hole. "Oh, come on, Ethan, don't be such a killjoy. Let me handle this one." A voice came from behind Ethan and she looked at him. That was when she realized they were not alone. There were 4 other men besides Ethan and her, including a man with a burn mark on his face who was staring at her. A sense of uneasiness arose in his eyes. There was something about him that felt familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Suddenly, a memory flashed in her mind. Months ago, she had come across a newspaper article about a notorious criminal named Thomas Martinez. He was infamous for his ruthless nature and involvement in various illegal activities. Her heart raced as she realized the man standing before her could be the same Thomas Martinez, wanted by the police for multiple crimes. Panic washed over her as she grasped the danger she was in. How had she ended up with a wanted criminal? Was this some sort of setup? Why hadn't Ethan told her that the meeting was cancelled or postponed? At least she could have stayed safe at home. Countless questions swirled in her mind, but she knew there was nothing she could do at that moment. Was this the end for her? Kaylee quickly looked down when she saw Thomas staring at her, with a charming smile on his face. He took a sip of wine and looked at the scene before him. It felt like watching a comedy show or an episode of Scooby-Doo. "Look up," he said, and she raised her face fearfully at Ethan's voice, but her eyes remained fixed on Thomas's feet. Her mind was focused on ensuring those footsteps did not approach her. Her breath quickened. "Look at me," he commanded again, but she continued to stare at Thomas's feet. Ethan stepped forward and forcefully lifted her hair to make her face him. When she finally looked up, she saw him leaning down in front of her. His eyes had a strange gleam like a wolf's eyes ready to attack its prey. It felt as if he could tear her apart any second. "When I give an order, it must be obeyed immediately." She trembled as Ethan's grip tightened on her hair, compelling her to meet his gaze. She stared into his cold and angry black eyes. Thomas, who had been enjoying the scene, finally spoke up. "Ethan, please don't hurt her." Ethan's grip loosened slightly, but his gaze remained fixed on her. "She needs to understand her place, Thomas. I cannot tolerate her disobedience. She is worth millions of dollars, so please don't harm her," Thomas said. Kaylee shifted her gaze from Ethan to Thomas, trying to comprehend his words. Any damage to her face would decrease her value. "She is precious," he smirked. Kaylee felt uneasy under Thomas's intense stare, a knot forming in her stomach. His words lingered in the air, causing her to question the situation. She released Ethan's grip on her hair, holding back her anger for a moment. His eyes flickered with a mix of curiosity and greed as he turned his attention to Thomas. "How much is she worth?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with intrigue. Thomas sat back on the sofa, his eyes darting between Ethan and Kaylee. "She is a rare, highly prized possession in the underground market. Her beauty, intelligence, and innocence all contribute to her significant price tag." Her heart raced as she listened to their conversation, realizing the seriousness of her predicament. She had always known she was beautiful, but she never imagined her value would one day be measured in dollars. Ethan walked toward Thomas, a sinister smile playing on his lips. "So, you're saying I could sell her and make a fortune?" "Yes, you can add her to those 50 girls," Thomas said, looking into Ethan's eyes. A wave of despair washed over her as she realized the depths of the darkness surrounding her. She had always dreamed of a life filled with love and freedom, but now those dreams seemed like distant fantasies. "But I will never let them decide my fate," Kaylee promised herself. She quickly got up and ran toward the door to save her life. Her heart hammered in her chest as fear coursed through her veins. "Catch her," Ethan ordered Thomas, and one of the guards grabbed her and forcefully slammed her into the wall. Her head hit a picture hanging on the wall, causing it to fall and shatter. Just as she hoped, Ethan delivered a strong slap to her cheek. "Don't try to run," he said, his voice deep and dark, sending shivers down her spine. He turned to face Thomas. "Take her out of here. We'll deal with the rest later." As Thomas reached forward to grab her again, she instinctively jerked back, pushed the guard, and managed to escape through the door. In her haste, she bumped into someone and nearly fell, but quickly recovered and started running again. The fear of being kidnapped by Ethan again propelled her to move even faster. She felt like she had no control over herself. Her body was moving on its own, not thinking straight, just doing what seemed like the best option for survival. Her mind was going haywire from all the stress and fear. All she wanted was a moment to breathe so that maybe, just maybe she would be able to stop crying, but her tears just wouldn't leave her eyes. Her body was so cold and sweaty, she could hardly walk without dropping something. She looked around for anything that could help her, but the only thing she saw was the stairs, which seemed impossibly far away. Instead of trying to escape down the stairs, she turned right and headed in a direction she hoped would be safer. But that path ended in a dead end with just one large window. "Just stop struggling now," Ethan said as he approached her. "You're making my job harder." Kaylee didn't reply, continuing to fight him with every ounce of strength she had. "We both know you won't get anywhere if you keep this up." She tried desperately to scream at him, but he clamped his hand over her mouth, silencing her. He grabbed her by the arms and dragged her toward him, forcing her to stand in front of him. She pushed him back, causing her foot to lose its balance. She reached for something to save herself but stumbled and fell through the window, plummeting from the 100th floor. As she fell, she cast a final glance at Ethan. His eyes were fixed upon her demise. Who was standing behind him? She wanted to know who had pushed her, as she clearly felt someone's hand on her shoulder while falling, but she lacked the breath to seek an answer to that question. All she could see was the blonde hair, as if someone were standing behind Ethan, but the darkness concealed their identity. As her body collided onto the unforgiving ground, the wind was knocked out of her and her eyes widened with shock as the ground rushed up to meet her, knocking the air out of her lungs. Just before landing, her head landed on the concrete, leaving a small cut on the back of her head just above the neck. It stung painfully and sent shooting pains throughout her entire body, but after some time she felt nothing. The world began to grow dark, and then it stopped completely. Few hours after murder, Ethan left his penthouse for a walk, lost in thought while smoking a cigarette when he heard his phone ring. He took it out of his pocket and saw a number displayed on the screen. "Why is my mom calling me now?" He frowned as he answered the call. "Has the meeting been postponed?" Miss Charlotte asked. "Yes, they will be here next week," Ethan replied, brushing his hair back from his forehead. He lied, knowing that the truth would only lead him to more trouble. "Why next week?" Miss Charlotte's voice was frustrated. "Do you not remember what we discussed yesterday?" She sounded slightly frantic. "There are some reasons. I'll explain in detail tomorrow." "What the heck?" Ethan exclaimed in frustration as a man pushed him forward. "I'll talk to you later about this. I'm busy at the moment," he quickly ended the call, keeping his eyes fixed on the person who had pushed him. "Hey, someone has fallen from above." "Yes, I heard something breaking, like someone fell from a high floor." "Has anyone died?" "It looks like a girl." "This seems to be a police case." "Is this a crime scene?" Gradually, people began to gather around Kaylee's lifeless body, engaging in hushed conversations and expressing their condolences for the deceased. Despite her passing, her eyes remained wide open, as if she had witnessed something peculiar before her demise and forgotten to close them. Her face bore a frozen expression of horror, with the skin around her mouth and under her chin appearing rigid, as if reluctant to detach from the bones. Her long black hair cascaded onto her forehead, prompting speculation about how she could have fallen and sustained such a severe head injury. Some speculated that she may have been thrown from a great height by a vengeful murderer, while others pondered the unfortunate circumstances that likely left her without a chance to seek help. Blood trickled from the side of her head, making its way to the back of her skull like water down a drain. Carefully, someone stepped over the bloodstain, feeling the thick, warm syrup-like sensation under their shoes. One hand rested on the floor while the other tightly gripped a shattered glass. Her right leg bent at an unnatural angle, with her foot slightly hovering above the ground. As news of Kaylee's death rapidly spread, the hotel staff promptly contacted the authorities. Frustrated, Ethan distanced himself from the crowd and made his way back to his penthouse. Standing there any longer made him nauseous. He couldn't handle the sight of blood. He felt disgusted by Kaylee's lifeless body. Upon entering his room, his gaze immediately fell upon Ava, who was seated on his bed. He was taken aback to see her there. "When did you return from Australia?" Ethan forced a smile and asked. "Well, you see," she began, attempting to sound sincere. "I have a layover in Washington, so as soon as I landed, I hurried straight here to meet you." Ethan remained silent for a moment, unable to help but notice how stunning she looked. Her black curls framed her pale face, and her amber eyes stared intently at him. She wore the most beautiful smile he'd ever seen. She narrowed her eyes, observing him closely. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yeah, I'm okay. It's just a business issue. You know, you were saying you came here for the first time. Do you want to explore the city?" He took a deep breath to collect his thoughts. "No, I don't want to explore the city. In fact, I wanted it to be a surprise," she responded, her intense gaze unwavering. "I thought it would be a romantic gesture to bring something special back for you. But I couldn't bear to wait any longer to see you, so I decided to come straight here instead." He just nodded, trying to walk away from her, but she hugged him from behind. "Why are you so quiet today?" she whispered, deliberately pressing her firm body against his back. She knew he wouldn't be able to resist. He never could. I have a lot weighing on my mind. He exhaled slowly and wearily. Then let me ease you, she smiled, positioning herself directly in front of him. May I have your permission? She always had a way of keeping him on his toes, knowing exactly how to make him do what she wanted. Charlotte was sitting in her luxurious mansion, in a room with a large view of the city below and the sea beyond. A glass of fine champagne in her hand and a letter from the Delish Delight Company's presidents, Mr. Corleone and Mr. Moretti, sitting atop a table beside the box of cake. She took another sip and then opened the letter. Her eyes roamed over the letter, taking in every word, as if she could somehow absorb it into her body. Suddenly she threw the champagne glass across the room, where it shattered on the floor. The shards of glass reflected light that fell through the walls onto Charlotte's face, making it look even paler than it already was. She read the letter faster this time. The words raced across the page but didn't get lost. Charlotte didn't need to read them more than once before they were embedded deep into her brain, forming an image that would last for weeks on end, even years. The letters continued to buzz through her mind like a swarm of angry insects, each word a painful sting that only fueled her rage. Charlotte clenched her fists, the paper crumpling beneath her grip as if it could absorb some of her fury. The threat looming over her business felt all-consuming, a dark cloud that would not dissipate. How dare they? She gritted her teeth, a fierce determination igniting within her. She glanced at the box of cake and threw into the wall, creating a satisfying thud as it bounced off. They're going to regret doing that. I'm gonna destroy their whole company, Charlotte yelled. Her voice rang through the air in a shrill crescendo. Even the servants standing outside of the door heard her voice. She took deep breaths before calling them inside. Clean this mess, she ordered them, and took a last glance at the cake as their words repeated again in her mind like a curse. And consider this cake a token of sympathy. I hope you still have your sweet tooth. With her arms crossed tightly across her chest, she stood there with a steely expression on her face. The servants hurriedly obeyed her commands and began to clean the mess on the ground with a broom and dustpan. Charlotte took another glass of champagne and drank it in one gulp. The maids followed suit as their hands held the dustpan filled with broken glass. They tried to clean the mess as fast as possible, but soon found themselves covered with blood and scratches from sharp pieces of glass still sticking into their skin. Get it cleaned up now, Charlotte commanded them furiously as her eyes glowed like red flames. And don't throw that cake, she commanded as another maid tried to pick it up. On Charlotte's command, she left it as it is and glanced at her. My friends sent it, showing their affection, so I have to accept it wholeheartedly, she smiled. Don't throw it, but save it. Charlotte's eyes twitched when she said that. Her words dripped with a veneer of sweetness, but beneath lay a storm of fury. Then her smile vanished, but there was something strange inside those eyes. They looked different than usual, but no one noticed. No one besides Charlotte. The servants hastily moved the broken pieces of glass on the ground and wiped the cake with a dry towel and put it back inside its cardboard box. Then they left her room immediately afterwards. They knew that when their lady boss was angry, it was best not to stay near her for too long. Charlotte sighed deeply as she watched the maids run away. She sat down again and sipped on her champagne, feeling numb all over. She was never fond of drinking alcohol, but after her encounter with the presidents of Delish Delight Company, she found herself craving to have some. It seemed that her soul ached, but her body didn't seem to be able to process the liquid, which was what caused this horrible reaction of hers. Ever since her company fell into this crisis, they have become threats to her business. They are the ones who complain to the authorities and damage the reputation of her company. She knows that they are the one after the food poisoning case, but she doesn't have any evidence yet. She even tried to settle this thing with them outside the court, but they demanded 60% of her Lopez Food Company, which she never let happen. Today they crossed all their limits. They sent her the legal notice of transforming the property along with the cake of their company. Charlotte felt the urge to laugh out loud. This is what they think, that her Lopez Food Company is an easy target for them to destroy. She chuckled as she took the last sip of her champagne. With red eyes burning with fury, she slammed the empty glass onto the table. She stared at the letter on the table. In a low, menacing tone, she muttered, "They should die. That's the least they deserve, right?" Charlotte extended her finger toward the letter but paused, a chill running down her spine. After a moment's hesitation, she grasped it firmly and ripped it into pieces. Soon the whole room was littered with countless crumpled-up pieces of paper, and some were still floating in the air. Then she got up and headed towards the bathroom to splash her face with cold water, which cooled down her anger slightly. Suddenly, Ethan's eyes snapped open as the alarm clock blared. He noticed that Ava was still fast asleep, so he reached over to the side table and turned off the alarm. Glancing at the clock, he saw that it was still 3 a.m. He picked up his pants from the floor and put them on before getting out of bed. He lit another cigarette and made his way out of the penthouse to smoke. The police lurked around, and Kaylee's lifeless body had been taken to the hospital for investigation. Detective Dario, the one he despised the most, was also present. Dario looked around the penthouse, trying to find any clue that could lead him to the investigation. Ethan sat on the bench and enjoyed his cigarette, making different shapes of smoke in the air. His eyes were half open, but he still looked focused on the road in front of him. Memories from the night before rushed back to him. He stared at Dario, a soft smile never leaving his lips. The detective was very tall, with short brown hair and a light beard that made him look old. When he saw Ethan, he walked toward him. "You're pretty calm about this situation," Detective Dario stated while leaning against the railing next to Ethan, "for a guy who killed a girl. How can you be so calm?" "Because I've experienced a lot worse than this before," Ethan responded. "What kind of experiences?" Detective Dario raised his eyebrow. "As if you don't know." Ethan stared deeply into his eyes and threw his cigarette on the road. "We both know you lied," Detective Dario said with no emotion whatsoever. "If you want to listen, then arrest me again. I just like to tell stories in the confession room." Ethan stubbed out a cigarette with his foot and walked away. "With pleasure, Mr. Lopez." Detective Dario shook his head with a sigh. There wasn't much he could do about Ethan. He always had to be suspicious of his motives. He knew that Ethan was an intelligent and powerful man, and Dario was sure he committed the murder. But like before, he never left any evidence. Dario was confident of Ethan's guilt, but he couldn't prove it yet. All he could do was watch him. As time passed, the hotel buzzed with activity. The once lavish hotel had transformed into a solemn place, haunted by the memory of Kaylee's lifeless body. 5 a.m. morning. It was 5 o'clock in the morning when Blair and Masson hurriedly made their way to the Luxor Lodgings Hotel, where they were supposed to arrive at 10:30 p.m. Exhausted from their long and difficult journey, they stumbled through the hotel entrance, drained of energy. The darkness of the early morning surrounded them as they quickly headed towards the entrance, desperately seeking relief from their weariness. He hides his short curly black hair under a hoodie and his warm brown eyes look curiously around people. Walking was becoming challenging for them, as they were wearing designer clothes for the first time today. Neither of them could afford such expensive clothing, but Masson was unsure where Blair had obtained so much money. When he asked her about it, she changed the topic and he didn't press further. Even if it was just for one day, he felt a sense of wealth. With anticipation and apprehension, they cautiously entered the hotel. Their hearts pounded as they were met with an unsettling silence, contrasting the usual bustling atmosphere. The surroundings were illuminated by the flashing lights of police cars, casting an ominous glow on the scene before them. His detective sense was telling him that it's a crime scene. Police officers, dressed in black uniforms, patrolled the area while taking photos of crime scene evidence with large cameras attached to their belts. As soon as Mason saw his senior detective Dairo, he quickly hid his face. As they approached the fountain, the sight of the yellow caution tape sent a shiver down their spine. It was a stark reminder that something terrible had happened within these walls. The words, "Do not enter," seemed to mock them, warning of the horrifying scene that awaited their arrival. Two exhausted police officers stood guard, their faces showing a mix of fatigue and disbelief. Their eyes met Blair's, silently conveying the seriousness of the situation. It was evident that they were not prepared for what lay beyond that forbidden boundary. They prohibited them from coming here. Mason quickly turned to Blair as he caught Dairos' eyes. Taking a deep breath, he gathered the courage to speak. "What could possibly happen here, Blair?" he asked, not sure what to say. His voice was barely audible. Blair mirrored his shock and confusion. Her usually composed demeanor faltered as she searched the area for answers that were yet to be discovered. "Looks like we're too late," Blair responded, a tinge of regret in her voice. "The meeting must have already ended." Blair's response really caught him off guard. He was quite surprised to see Blair tilting her head back and gazing up at the towering height of the hotel. "There has been a murder here, Blair," he tried to remind her. She first looked at him and then at the police officers standing in front of them. "But we didn't come here for this murder case. The police will take care of it. We're actually late because Thomas Martin must be gone by now." Her words reminded him of their mission for being here. They walked into the hotel's spacious hall, trying to hide their identities by keeping their heads held high. All the staff at the reception were watching them. Blair took out a golden card with a capital O written on it from her designer bag. "Opulent Heights Penthouse MasterCard." Mason looked at her in surprise, leaning in to whisper in Blair's ear. She just smiled in response. Being a chef, she is well prepared, as if she is a professional spy or an undercover agent. They approached the sleek glass elevator at the end of the hall, its doors beckoning them to step inside. As they entered, the elevator operator greeted them with a polite nod and pressed the button for the Opulent Heights penthouse on the 100th floor. The doors closed, enclosing them in a small mirrored space. As the elevator began its ascent, Mason couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. Reaching the penthouse was no ordinary feat. The elevator glided smoothly upwards, the soft music playing in the background adding to the air of mystery. He felt as if he were about to be granted entry to one of the most secure locations in Washington. The man who owned it, Dylan Gabriel, was an influential figure, and a billionaire. He knew of Dylan's many philanthropic efforts to help poor people and others of every kind. He is a self-made person who owns many businesses, including Gabriel Foundation, where he provides free education, health checkup and food for the homeless. Being his friend Ethan had a meeting at his place today, as Dylan stays in New York. Blair and Mason exchanged a knowing glance, silently reminding each other of the importance of their task. Blair had been sent here to retrieve a valuable piece of information that could potentially change the course of history, and Mason had only come to help his fiancée. He knows it's not that important, but since Blair asked him for help, he's doing it only for his love. As the elevator doors opened on the 100th floor, they stepped out and their eyes immediately locked onto the sleek black door of the penthouse. Blair confidently inserted the golden card into the electronic lock, as if this is her usual place to visit. With a soft click, the door swung open, revealing a truly breathtaking sight. They entered the penthouse and cautiously began exploring. To their surprise, there was no sign of anyone except for a girl peacefully sleeping in Ethan's master bedroom. Blair and Mason exchanged glances, realizing that not only was Thomas Martin absent, but Ethan himself was not there. They definitely come late. "Not only Thomas Martin, but Ethan too," Mason muttered, looking at Blair. "We're really late." "Thieves often leave their mark as they go, Mason," Blair replied cryptically. "Stop repeating my words, Miss Detective B," Mason chuckled. "By the way, why did you come when you knew we were late?" Blair rolled her eyes when he called her B. It's not like she doesn't like it. She just likes anyone to call her B except one person. "Because Ethan is still inside," she said confidently and looked into his eyes. "And how are you so sure about this?" Mason raised his eyebrow. "I know something that you don't," she smiled and winked at him.